Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earthcare should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Hey, Earthkeepers. Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Wes Willison. For those of you who listened to the first part of our talk in episode 106, you'll recall that the conversation was pretty emotionally intense at times, but that's because we were trying to tackle some hard truths about how younger generations are struggling with the prospect of an increasingly troubled future for the planet. Now, to be honest, while I went into the conversation with Wes assuming that he and his community had serious concerns, I don't think I realized just how heavy those concerns were or how profoundly they impacted their decisions about community, family, and vocation. And especially because I consider Wes to be family, the conversation impacted me deeply on a personal level. Well, rather than edit out the emotional moments, we decided to leave them as they were, for the sake of honesty and truth-speaking. And as you'll hear in this episode, the second half of our conversation was just as moving for us as it might be for you. In this episode, though, we focus more directly on the overarching theme of Season 5, in which we've been exploring the idea that every vocation can somehow be made greener. That is, in almost every job, we can find ways to practice the values of earthkeeping. As a real estate agent in Philadelphia, Wes has given a lot of thought to how his work of helping people to find homes is essentially ecological work and an expression of creation care. That's where we pick up the conversation now, where we turn to the questions of home and land and ownership. And just a note, at the end of the episode, I'll give you some information about Wes's own podcast focused on those very themes. I want to get really specific to your life, your community, and maybe you could talk about your friends. What are some of the things they are concerned about? What do you guys wrestle with in conversations together?
I'm in a reading group right now with a few friends who are in various places in their relationship with church and their relationship with politics. It's probably 6 of us. We meet maybe every other week to once a month. We're reading a lot of leftist theory, sure, also mixed in with theology, reading some James Cone, reading various things. I think maybe 2 of us have some seminary education. The other people are sort of just very well read, very thoughtful, very curious. That's the place probably where I'm having these conversations the most frequently right now. And this was something none of us were getting in our church contexts, definitely not in other more secular contexts, so we tried to make this space for ourselves. I think a common thread that's come through those conversations is, one, with systemic injustice, what do we do with things like complicity? How do we make sense of being involved in and yet also not responsible exclusively for the kinds of systemic injustice we see all around us, or the kinds of ecological disasters that all of us play a part in, and yet none of us have the power to change? That is a big conundrum. Another being, and this is probably the biggest reason I went into real estate at all, the question of ownership. To own something, to be simple, to have that bundle of rights over something is a very, very mixed bag at this point in human history, right? Like, of anything, there's few things more powerful than having a space you can call your own and where you can really belong. But at the same time, our ideas and legal practices around ownership have produced kind of inequality and pretty callous attitude towards the commons, towards the earth, towards however you want to define it. Ownership is a really big concern. There's something really wrong here, and yet there doesn't seem to be a way through life without engaging with it in a positive sense and saying, I am going to be an owner of something. I don't want to be a renter my whole life. And yet that's shot through with this complicity conversation and with this lurking question in the back of my head. I'm owning, and now I'm like perpetuating a system that I cannot believe in, and yet I cannot survive without, right? That's a dilemma. And I hear many of my friends expressing that dilemma. And this is conversation that I have in real estate, but people have already, in most senses, come to an answer on the positive side in response, right? They are saying, no, I do know I need to own. Help me do that in a way that's perhaps less problematic than it otherwise would be. And so I stand fully in that mystery that we don't have an answer yet, and yet this is what it takes to survive, right? To minimize precarity and increase resilience does involve ownership, even at the same time as we don't have an answer to how to fix the ills that come from ownership. Does that make sense?
It does. More sense than you know, because I have a new job. I'm the executive director of Pacific Rim Institute. We're on Whidbey Island. We're like this 175-acre piece of land, and we're actually trying to put much of it right now into kind of a conservancy, right, to protect it for the future. But as we manage it in the meantime, that question of ownership has become enormous. I feel responsible actually to make decisions about how we look at the question of ownership for the future. Just last weekend, we had what's called the camas bake, and multiple tribes in the area come together, gather for a festival for 3 days on the land. Camas is a bulb that's a traditional native food in this region. And so we have some native prairie and some restored prairie, and it includes this native species, camas. And so the native folks come and dig the camas. A lot of youth come and they learn about the traditions around this food, camas. But being with them, watching them, seeing their communities come together on this place, these 175 acres, it made me happy and sad at the same time. Happy to see that they had access, right? That they could use this space for learning, for community, for recovering traditions, for teaching youth and passing on traditions. At the same time, I thought, it's sad that they had to have our permission to do that. And there's part of me that, when I think about the future of my role with Pacific Rim, it's very much right now about finding ways to blurring those lines of ownership, and as much as possible welcoming Native people back to this space, because this space was at one time a historical site that no one owned, that many tribes came together and collectively gathered camas. That's what they had always done. It was the commons, as you put it, that was shared equally among all the people. So I'm just wondering, what can I do to promote that re-inhabiting of the land without having to deal with the messiness of ownership? Maybe seeing the fact that we own the land as perhaps something that's going to enable us to chip away at the boundaries that ownership can put up. So, and I'll have to say that it wasn't just seeing folks use the land that we manage, but our neighbors also have camas growing their fields, right? And they've got 5-acre, 10-acre plots. And they said, everyone's welcome. Come onto our land. Come and dig up the camas. The goodness of the people to overcome their maybe instincts of ownership, to put up fences and to take down the fence and say, you are welcome here. That just for me was profoundly beautiful. So all to say, this question of ownership has been enormous in my life lately. So I'm glad you brought that up. In this season, season 5, we are focusing on a question as a theme, and that is, how can we green every vocation? And that might be assuming a lot about how you do the work of helping people sell houses, but I suspect that your work is actually values motivated, as everything that you do is. I'm wondering, you mentioned concerns about ownership, worries about being able to own, affordability. Tell me about your work and maybe the ways that you have discovered or created to connect your real estate work to the work of earthcare specifically and social justice in general.
How am I greening real estate or work as a realtor? There are 2 ways I could go. I think I'm going to start with the word greening. Part of what I realized during my academic work at the Farminary was the lines around something like urban life or real estate or architecture or name another particularly concrete, cement, brutalist idea, and separating that out from what could possibly be considered green. And this natural versus anthropogenic or human-centered division is, intellectually, it's one thing to recognize that that's arbitrary or ridiculous. It's a lot harder to actually stare at a neighborhood like mine, Port Richmond or Fishtown or Kensington, and say this too is ecology, right? That the human animal participating, forming, interacting with this space is producing ecological outcomes that affect not just us humans, but the world around us. What do the efforts to be a cultivator of healthy space in a city look like? Is that really just setting up urban gardens? Or is it actually incorporating an idea like ownership, recognizing that of all the ideas we have, maybe that's the one that drives the bulk of our short-sighted decision-making around what kind of space we're forming for ourselves to live in. That may feel like a long skip, like a very roundabout way to get to a question like greening. I think the shorter distance is to go through a lot of the things that someone like the National Association of Realtors, they already offer courses on, say, higher efficiency heating and cooling systems, or how to improve the envelope of your home, the kinds of paint colors for your roof that will mean you reflect more heat rather than incorporate it, things like that. Those are technical questions. That's fine. We can do the technical stuff around real estate. I'm trained in that. I help people with that all the time. The 10,000 or maybe the 10-year view is, what would it mean to green our understanding of ownership, of the fee simple rights and privileges that we give to owners, of the ways we think about property boundaries, the ways we organize mortgages, the ways the 30-year mortgage built for a different generation, right? People had a different set of work options ahead of them, and people who are working now in the gig economy, it just looks dramatically different, right? And also generational differences around attitudes towards things like unions. We haven't seen, say, the sort of cooperative attitude, which is a very ecological model, move into something like homeownership or into the real estate space. That isn't a transition that the mortgage industry or homeowners in general have really taken up. It's fraught with difficulties. Chesterton's fence is a favorite example I like to think about. Chesterton writes about, you buy a piece of land and you, the young homeowner, you young property owner, notice a fence built out in the middle of a field. And you say, why is this fence here? I will tear it down. And Chesterton says, no, until you understand why that fence is there, leave the fence. Don't touch it until you really understand why it's there. And that's been my experience of real estate so far, is there are so many fences scattered throughout the whole system of real estate. And some of them seem really, really dumb. But with patience, with some sense of like, hold on, there's a lot of bad actors, there's a lot of mistrust and unequal sides of information here. There's a reason why the system looks the way it does. And it's built conservatively to protect the people who are just trying to do the thing that's right for their family. If you take that as the basis and then look from there, then you start to realize how some of these answers develop. But that's still a question of ecology. It's still about greening that. What does it mean to turn that towards a vision of life where we can incentivize, recognize, sure, but incentivize interconnectedness and dependency on each other, codependency? What would block control of all of the properties on a block look like? Could a block be the institutional entity that owns the properties that are being rented out to people on that block? That would be interesting, right? What could renting without landlords look like? That's definitely a green idea for me, but that is not necessarily what I'd categorize before I started this work as green work. Those are the things that I'm aiming towards, while at the same time staying involved in things like, yes, let's plant trees in the neighborhoods, let's take over some of these lots that have been left abandoned and set gardens down. Let's build institutions that can protect these lots. Things like land trusts, land banks, looking towards the next 10, 20, 30 years. Given the systems we already have, maybe there are adjustments with the protocols won't shift. Given that, what could this resilience look like if nothing changes? But also, what seeds can we plant now that maybe could produce protocol changes 10, 20, 30 years from now in ways that could mean, if you have these moral commitments or these ethical understandings, these spiritual resonances with interdependency, communal life, co-ownership, that there would be options more than what we have on the table right now. Oh, that gets me excited. And it's also, that is a moonshot project, right? That is not something that we're particularly far on, at least in this country. Other places have more public options, have more government involvement in answering questions like this. It's a bit trickier in America. We just have more of a hands-off capitalist approach. So given those, I like to call it gravity problem, can't try to change all of America, but maybe we could try to change how the gravity of America's institutions affects a neighborhood like Kensington. Maybe we can. Maybe there's a few things we can try that 5 years from now we can look back and say, did that work or didn't it? Well, we know a little bit more about what it looks like to green real estate in a neighborhood like this.
What I find particularly inspiring, intriguing, surprising about your answer as a whole here is you're kind of taking apart that word green in its conventional understanding. You're deepening it. And in particular, I hear you saying that your work, even though you're dealing very much with human concerns and human society, you're blurring the boundary in terms of what creation means, what counts as ecology. There is not necessarily the line between human society and the rest of creation, which is part of the problem that we're in, is based on that false dichotomy. Your perspective seems a little bit more integrated. And in fact, as you spoke, what came to mind is the fact that the word ecology is based on the root word oikos, which is house.
The law of the house, yeah, how it's organized.
In a sense, you're really an ecologist in the deepest sense of the word, and that you're dealing with homes.
Yeah, if we are animals and this is how we shape our environment to be home for us, then of course our homes are ecological. We may have a pretty short-sighted or pretty limited capacity to understand some of the long-term effects of the homes that we're living in, but that doesn't change the fact that we're animals. In rock climbing right now, there's a controversy around climbing shoes. The kind of rubber that you have on your shoes is a really big deal for performance. You need really sticky rubber. And the stickiest of rubbers, we've just learned in the last month or so, they're made with PFAS or forever chemicals. And when you're climbing and you rub the rubber down on your shoes, little bits of dust goes up into the air in this enclosed climbing gym and you end up breathing it in. So there are all these health concerns, as well as the attendant systemic concerns of why wasn't anyone paying attention to this? We've known about PFAS for a minute. Why are we only learning in this past month or so that these chemicals are present in shoes? Who's at fault there, right? Who do we blame? Is blame even the right conversation? Is one person really guilty for all of the things that will happen because of PFAS being in people's bodies? I don't think so. But it is an ecological question, even in something where literally the handholds for climbers are made of plastic. They're like a resin that's put in molds and you grab it. This is an ecological question. And the discourse given to me by my ancestors, so people like the Audubon Society, conservation, you name it. I'm standing on the shoulders of these conversations and then looking at, okay, what does this mean now for those of us who are going to be renters for the next decade in environments that are extremely concrete heavy, do not have access to the quote unquote green spaces that so many of us look for in an activity like climbing, or even just to have dogs, to be participants in a gardening, in a productive, cultivating society. A lot of those options are foreclosed by mechanisms given to us by the market. So then what does an ecological conversation look like for us? It does have to go through all these ideas that I just said, as much as they go for everyone else, but our focus has sort of been forced into thinking about, okay, well, I bike on concrete and asphalt all day. That is an ecological activity. I have to be able to think about it that way, because I can't just switch this part of my brain on when I encounter something that's literally the color green, because Philadelphia is not a very green city. There's just not very much green until you get to the parts of the city where it is extremely wealthy, where there's massive institutional connections and prodigious wealth being brought to bear to then have a conversation about going green as one more element of privilege, right? Another feather that you stick in your political cap of saying, yes, I too shop at Whole Foods. That's not the case for the most of the neighborhoods that I live in. So then what does a conversation about going green look like when you can afford $700-800 a month for rent? You cannot afford to spend that much in groceries to eat in a particular way. There are other upstream concerns that are coming downstream. That means that your diet, your physical activity, your relationship to whatever the real estate industry wants to call green. It's so backed up. There's so many other things upstream. And so a lot of my work has been, okay, wherever people are in their process of real estate, one, I need to actually solve your problem. We need to get you a place where you can be safely in a space where you can belong, that fits your needs, that is accessible to what you need. There's just a very specific technical work of real estate. And then beyond that, can that also tie into your deepest ethical, spiritual, personal concerns? Because for so many of us, this is a third of our income. It's a massive amount of our time given to this search. And then, of course, we're spending so much time in these spaces ecologically as persons, as animals, navigating a physical environment. Then also all those concerns on top of just the very basic, I need somewhere to be so I don't end up on the street. I do find these woven together. And for me, these are very satisfying conversations. For a lot of the clients that I work with, there's a lot of disquiet around the contradictions or frustration around the concessions that you have to make ethically, that I have to give up this thing I really believed in because I just don't have the money for it. Or I have to foreclose this conversation that maybe I'd like to get into when I'm ready to become a homeowner. But as a renter, I just need to find a place. I can't think in this sort of expansive attitude towards making an ethically or ecologically sound choice. I just have to get something done. I walk people through that conversation of saying, this is not your fault that you can't afford that. There are other systems at work that have given you the set of choices that you have to make, and that doesn't affect how worthy you are, especially of love or of a future that I hope we can build together. But most of the clients that I work with, they can't make that choice. It's foreclosed to them. That's painful. It's really hard to see that every day. But that's the work, right? That's why I do this, to be with people through those choices. And it doesn't feel like a loss or a death necessarily. You're still finding a new place to live. But it is emotionally potent to have to say no to a dream for the sake of something very specific in this rental unit with a landlord you don't like and a property management company you're sick of. Dealing with resources that are too scant for the kinds of things you want for yourself, while you then look across the room of the city and you see wealthier people bragging about how green their lifestyles are. It can be very frustrating.
I hear the compassion in your voice and see it on your face. And what strikes me is that you are not separating your work from love, that your vocation, you're actually making me.
Feel it.
I know. Okay. Your work of real estate is inseparable from the work of love, fundamentally, that your clients and your concern for their best interest is, your relationship with them is characterized by love. Am I reading that right?
I would hope so. Yeah. That's at least the intent I bring. I think ultimately any ecological approach will come back to love. An actual openness and acceptance, not just a tolerance, but an embrace of everything that we encounter, saying this too will be in the kingdom of God. That love will be present here too. When we're talking about the depression that so many of my generation feel, I think it's born of that. Could not this too also be better? And then hearing the world say, no, actually, this is the way it is, and it's going to be pretty dark for as far as we can see into the future. That's where you really start to feel pretty bad. If you anticipated that everything would be that bad anyways and didn't have a hope for a better arrangement, then it wouldn't be quite so disappointing.
I think you advocate for focusing just on what you can deal with, and what you can deal with, focus on.
Right.
Big
Yeah.
way. And focus for you means going all in and saying, what is then my role as an agent of love, as an agent of change, of healing? And these things I have chosen to focus on.
Yeah. I think theologically or theoretically, you could probably trace this through things like anarchism, the DIY movement, various parts of leftism, things like that. But I think spiritually, this comes straight from just the ways I see Jesus treat people. Very much takes them on their terms. It says what you're dealing with, the cards you were dealt, the hand you were dealt, is the measure by which I will give you power to be my presence in the world. Not to take on the things that I have no expectation of you dealing with, but the things that you are. People you are given to love, I will help you love them. I don't ask you to love the people that you are not ever going to encounter or don't have the capacity to love. I think that's very much our encounter with the world as it is. And we call it real estate. But the ways in which we are given or introduced to or forced into relationships to any specific place, I would hope all of that can come under, if you are a Christian listening to this, I would hope that every encounter that you have with any place in the world could be informed by your understanding of the kingdom of God. And that your love of Jesus, that your experience of what Jesus' presence looks like, feels like, what that can be, would then be read back to you by the ways in which you encounter love in the places that you navigate. We may have wrong names for it right now. We may call it real estate. We may call it politics. We may call it zoning, urban planning, design, whatever. But that sense that this too will be under the realm of God at some point in a way that generates life rather than takes it. I get very excited about that kind of ecology. That's a really exciting ecology. But it is a mixed, multiple ecology of many, many different kinds of people, of ideas, of presences, all encountering each other in a space like that. And so to back off from maybe some of the colonial mentalities that come from that is also, again, part of what we talk about when we're having ecological conversations, and maybe isn't what we're talking about it when I say the word real estate, given its broader significance in American discourse. When I say real estate, it generally comes with a very colonial mentality. And so this backdoor trick that I'm pulling and shifting the terms of things like green and real estate doesn't work in every sense, because the attitudes of humility, of placing others first, or the needs of the less powerful first in ecological conversations, that is very much needed and to be transported or to be fit into the worlds of real estate that I deal with. And that is a long, slow process. I'm learning more and more about that every day. But it's often happening in situations where that is farthest thing from people's mind, is they're just trying to get a space for them and their kids before they have to move out of their current rental.
I want to hear more about what it looks like to decide what you can focus on and then go all in. And I know that you and Hannah have made real deliberate choices to live in your community in ways that reflect that, I guess on the one hand, resistance, but also reflect that refusal to despair. Tell me about bees and their role in your life and in your community.
Ooh, bees. So becoming a beekeeper was mostly Hannah's idea. I have to give her credit for that. So through 2020 especially, I think she was looking at a lot of bee content on YouTube and on Instagram, and started poking around in Philadelphia, found that there is a pretty sizable community of beekeepers, mostly organized through Facebook. There's a Philadelphia beekeepers group on Facebook that if you see a swarm, or if someone tells you about a swarm, then it'll get posted on the group, and then someone from the beekeepers group will go pick up the swarm. A swarm is when a hive gets so big and is really so healthy that they need to multiply. You could think of bees in two senses. One as individual bee organisms, the second as the hive as an organism. The way a hive reproduces is by swarming. So they'll send off a queen with a ton of the bees as well, and leave behind a smaller proportion to maintain the hive as it is and grow back to where it was before. If you have experience in church planting or in business replication or whatever, this will be familiar to you. But swarms will leave the hive. They'll land somewhere nearby where they can rest and wait for the recon bees to come back with their information about the next best place to go. And based on that information, they'll then move to their new home. When a bee swarms is the indication to beekeepers, you have to get this swarm right now before it finds the eave of someone's house or the vent fan from someone's bathroom for the bees to then move in, because that's when it gets really painful for everyone involved, right? Bees typically don't survive a move into a space like that. Exterminators will come and kill them. Typically, it's not legal, but it does happen. Or humans will get stung. There will be problems in that direction. So when that call comes, at this point, Hannah and I go and we help relocate these bees. We only caught one swarm this year, but it's still May. Saying is a swarm in May is worth a bale of hay. Swarm in June is worth a silver spoon. Swarm in July isn't worth a fly. As this summer goes on, there's just less and less chance that a swarm could relocate to a new home and be resilient enough through the coming winter. They just don't have enough time to build up their stores of supplies. Working with bees on things like swarms, on relocating them, on finding which places in the city are actually ready to accept a swarm, and it's still within reach of Hannah and I, so we can still care for it. All of those things have deepened our connection to our neighborhood in some very interesting ways. We've learned where all the beekeepers of Philly live. They're really interesting people. They're often tucked away in some of the nooks and crannies of the city, and these homes that maybe you wouldn't expect from the outside to be as large and expansive in the back. Some of them have multiple lots on these blocks that have maybe 40, 50 houses to a block. One house, you may look out the back and realize it's actually accumulated a lot of the empty lots maybe on the other side. And so they have all these garden beds and they have all these hives over in the corner. And this is the slow, secret work of 40, 50 years of cultivating Philadelphia. So I mentioned when you find a worm in the soil, you shout doxa. When you find a beekeeper in the wild, it's kind of like, oh, here's some people who are turning over the soil of Philadelphia in ways that are very interesting. There's more good things happening in the city than maybe it looks at first. Be ready to be surprised by that. This has just been a really joy-giving experience to be a beekeeper in the city because of all that. These are people, for the most part, are not tooting their own horn and bragging about all their successes on Instagram and Facebook. They're actually able to work better because they're off of those platforms, and thus their stories don't get spread quite so much. So it's a bit of a positive feedback for the sake of the bees, negative feedback for the sake of storytelling to people who might be stuck on the internet all the time. So if you're in Philadelphia, if you're in the region, if you're hearing this and you want to see the bees, come see the bees. They're very friendly. Honeybees are, for the most part, just happy to build their hive. We have precautions we take as beekeepers to make sure we don't appear as a threat to them. And then we're very easily able to inspect the hive, check that the queen is okay, see that the brood is being produced and that the honey is being collected, all those things, making sure there's no disease, no mites, no pests, no ants sneaking into the hive, no dogs or anyone else knocking it over to get at the honey. This has been as involved a cultivation work as anything we ever did in a garden at the Farminary. Beekeeping has been wonderful. Highly recommend. 10 out of 10.
You do realize the beautiful irony in the fact that in your mission to find new homes for bee communities, that you're kind of a bee real estate agent, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm like, hey, you guys are looking over here. This is the wrong place for you. Got to redirect you over here. This is where you're going to be healthier than if you go into this place. Yeah.
To return to the question, this bigger question of how someone of your generation lives with ecological, political, economic realities of an uncertain future, what does it take to stay the course? I mean, what might you say to younger generations even who follow you about what that means to live well, to live with courage, to live in a way that you do what you're able to do out of things that you've been given?
I wish I knew. I think that to the degree that Hannah and I have been able to live according to what you just said, as much as we have, I would say community. Being with people who inspire you, who you trust to tell you no. That's, I think, one definition of church, is someone whose life you entrust to enough that they can say, hey, this is not good for you, or this is not good for us, and we're telling you no. That is a big thing. I think community that you can walk to, right? That are that close physically, that it's proximate. It's so easy to think about community in a broad general sense because most of us have to think about it that way. But the more that can become, we encounter it in undergrad, in a dorm, if you've ever done dorm living, or if you're living currently with roommates, if you're co-housing right now, you can feel the difference of physical proximity to everything else, right? Just one house away versus 4 houses away versus a block away versus half mile. How easy it is to build communities isn't a linear correlation with distance from that person. It's really, there's just a cliff. Once it's not a walk, then you go off a cliff. Then it's like you might as well get in the car and go literally anywhere. Being able to walk to people, I just really think that is a worthwhile investment if you're in a space where you can make that choice to live next to people who love you and who you love. It's just so meaningful. That's been such a boon to Hannah and I at every stage in our life, whether that's living with roommates who loved us and supported us through things we needed help with, to being now on the same block. We have many people on this block we were in church with together. We've done small groups together. We potted through the quarantine together. We still share meals together. Our direct neighbors, our close friends, they cook Mondays and Wednesdays. Hannah and I cook Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we share meals. Most of the days of the week, we don't actually want to see each other. We just drop the food off on each other's back porch. But, once a week, we'll have dinner together and just check in. And those rhythms, those routines are really powerful. I think a lot of what I had hoped for, community being a gift of the church, right? Something that the church could help me with, has run aground in various ways over the last few years. The church is nonetheless still a very powerful source of community, but not necessarily the healthiest one in many, many, many cases. And then alternatively, secularity, boy, this sells you out when it comes to community. Everything's pay to play. Very hard to find community if all you live by is the rules of secularity. One of the ways in which both of those, whatever your situation is, can be a bit healthier is just literally physically where you are. You can physically be close to people who you can build a life together with. I would say that's the biggest thing. That's the biggest reason Hannah and I go to this climbing gym so much. We're there 2, 3, sometimes 4 days a week. In part, to exercise. Sure, exercise is nice, especially when you work jobs that are mostly in ideas or in emails and writing and whatever. But also just because the social life of a climbing gym is very conducive to making friends. And we're in our 30s. It's hard to make friends. You go to a climbing gym and you can only climb a fraction of the time. The rest of the time you have to stand there waiting for your body to recover. And so you chat with people. And it ends up being a really nice experience. And that really does, it's the wind in our sails towards various projects, ways we encounter each other, ways we encounter the world. Those social interactions are really meaningful to us. So if I could say one thing, it would be community. And don't underestimate how physical that response really is, that it means being near people.
Yeah, I would say that maybe a point I'm taking away that applies to everyone, especially regarding community, is the importance of having people that you can actually mourn with, right? That you can actually be in struggle with. I'm not sure if people have a sense of the fact that you and I are wiping away tears almost through this whole podcast.
I think it'll be audible.
Yeah. But I think that it's a reminder to me of how important that is to have people with whom you can weep as well as celebrate. We've been in conversation with Wes Willison, a man striving to be a greener real estate agent. If you want to hear more of his thoughts about community, place, and home, I highly recommend his podcast and his Substack column, both called How to Get Home. Finally, please help us to get the Earthkeepers podcast out to more listeners. In particular, if you know of any real estate agents or even folks looking to buy or sell or rent a home who would benefit from hearing this podcast conversation, please share with them a link to this episode. You'll find more information about Wes's work and about some of our conversation topics on the podcast webpage at earthkeepers.online. The Earthkeepers podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization committed to cultivating a more ecologically conscious faith. For more information about the podcast or to learn about the ways you can support this work, go to our website at earthkeepers.online. You can contact us by leaving a voicemail through the podcast website or by emailing us at earthkeepers@circlewood.online. I am Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. James Amidon is our executive producer. Our content editor and researcher is Colleen Meggerly, and our sound engineer is Dave Wolfers. Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director, and Forrest Reed is the composer of our original music. Thank you for listening, friends, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.